Hi folks, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about an aspect of nuts and bolts of tabletop game design and of course video games when they are more like tabletops. I'm going to talk about triangles in conflict, and this is derived from rock, paper, scissors of all things. It's a matter of combat methods. Conflict games sometimes use hierarchical conflict resolution. This is the method primarily used in Stratego. So pieces have a strength. The higher strength beats the lower strength. Ties result in both being eliminated. Usually there are no dice involved, though you could combine strength plus a die roll and the higher would win the combat. And so a weaker piece could beat a stronger piece if they were more successful with their dice roll. Now there's an even more common method, which is the uniform method, which is to say every piece is the same strength. So risk, you have a bunch of armies. Diplomacy, you have armies and fleets, but they're all the same strength. In my game Britannia, it's mostly uniform, except that you have cavalry and Romans as the one exception, or the main exception. Now, I'm talking generally about tactical in the effect, not strategic, in case that wasn't clear. And the effects are easier to see among distinct units, such as ships, rather than ground units comprised of many men. But it can be done that way too. Now, there's a circular method which corresponds better to actual military situations because it better represents combined arms fighting. And this is most well known, oddly enough, in the game Rock, Paper, Scissors. In Rock, Paper, Scissors, each of the three elements can beat one of the others and loses to one of the others. So rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper wraps up and beats rock. Now in RPS, this is deterministic. In many other games, there are chance elements combined with this. Obviously, this is different from hierarchical or uniform. And once again, triangle method emphasizes combined arms, hierarchy and uniform do not. Usually, however, the situation in real combat is not as simple as in RPS, let alone in hierarchy or uniform. There are more types of units, both within a type, such as armored vehicles, and within larger types, such as armored ships. The armored ships, you have battleships, cruisers, and so forth. So let's have some examples. Land warfare, World War II. Tanks overwhelm infantry. Anti-tank weapons defeat tanks. Infantry overwhelms anti-tank units. So tanks unaccompanied by infantry are quite vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, especially as bazookas and the like are invented that infantry can use. Now, on the other hand, World War II air warfare combat is largely uniform. Yes, you have fighters and bombers, and you also have unarmed targets. But it doesn't work in an RPS style. It's just some of them have guns, some of them do not. The bombers are mainly defensive, the fighters are mainly offensive. Now, how about early 20th century naval surface warfare? You had torpedo boats, which were later displaced by torpedo boat destroyers, which is where the term destroyer comes from. And those torpedo boats were dangerous for battleships and dreadnoughts, which at that point could take very few torpedoes before they would sink. Cruisers were the antidote for the torpedo boat destroyers, and the battleships and dreadnoughts killed cruisers. The torpedo boats gradually disappeared from fleet battles at sea because they were too small to go to sea comfortably, and they were replaced by the vessels originally intended to destroy them, that is, destroyers. Later, they were also displaced by submarines, which may be a fourth link. Destroyers defeat submarines, submarines defeat battleships, battleships defeat cruisers, cruisers defeat destroyers. And of course, later on in World War II, aircraft became dominant at sea, though the basic triangle otherwise was still there. How about air-ground? Well, airplanes are tough on artillery. Artillery is tough on air defenses, depending on the range. And air defenses are tough on airplanes. This is not perhaps as clear cut, and obviously it depends on the exact time period and location. For example, it doesn't really apply today in Ukraine. Now, another contrast is the age of sail. 18th century and Napoleonic wars at sea were dominated by the ship of the line and line tactics. The big ships lined up and blasted away at each other. Smaller vessels such as frigates and sloops stayed out of the line of battle because they were too fragile to survive and their guns were too small to have much effect, even if they had sufficient range. This is not hierarchical though, it's a modified form of uniform. So some ships of the line were much larger than others, say 100 guns, 110 guns, even 120 guns, compared to the standard 74, but they all fought in the line. It is hierarchical in the sense that if a ship of the line came up against a frigate, the frigate was probably doomed. And if a frigate came up against a sloop, the sloop was probably doomed. What about ancient battles at sea? And notice I've been using the sea here for examples because it's more clear-cut when you have individual units. Ancient battles at sea were largely uniform. The Greeks mostly used triremes, called triremes because there were 3 sets of oars inside the ship on 2 different levels. The Romans and Carthaginians much later mostly used quinquiremes, which were possibly 5 sets of oars, but more likely 5 men on 3 oars. They were much bigger than triremes. There were smaller ships, but the ones listed were the ones that fought the big battles. Now, how about space war, that is science fiction? Well, in some military science fiction, the triangle is used. Big ships, dreadnoughts, battleships, overcome cruisers or corvettes or frigates, and those smaller ships overcome fighters, and fighters overcome the big ships. Typically, there's some kind of missile or torpedo involved that fighters can take close to the enemy, but not the ridiculous Star Wars fighters shooting some kind of guns, lasers, whatever, to blast huge enemy ships. That becomes ridiculous. I don't find fighters very convincing, and of course, in much of science fiction, the situation is more like the Age of Sail, where the big ships line up and blast away at each other, and the small ships tend to stay out of the way or just fight each other off to the side. I suppose you could write a book chapter about this, but this is enough to show the various methods. Thanks for listening.